Bernard said, I've been asked to frame these screenings a bit for you. I will be talking a bit about HONG Sangsoo at the end, but first I want to talk a bit about Korean cinema in general. But before that, it's interesting to note that this is quite an exceptional occasion because it's quite difficult nowadays to see Korean films projected on screen in Belgium. There are not many films coming out, Korean films coming out in Belgium. As a matter of fact, there's one coming out in March, a new film by Bong Joon-ho called Snowpiercer. And if my memory serves right, it will be the first Belgian release of a Korean film in more than 2 years since The House made a film that you might know, the remake of the classic 1960s film by Kim Yoon. Of course, it's not like the case. It's not like the Belgian cinemas were flooded by Korean films before, but let's say 10 years ago, at least we could see all the new films by Kim Ki-duk, Park Chan-wook, or also HONG Sangsoo here in the Belgian cinemas. The prominence of Korean films in Belgian cinema was not a coincidence. Beginning of the 21st century, Korean cinema was really at its peak, and it was also embraced by the international film community as the most interesting cinema of that moment. That high standard was a result of a decade-long rise in quality in the Korean cinema. There were experiments galore. Korean films showed an unprecedented boldness, and they showed it in the stories that they told, they showed it in the way they structured their stories, and they showed it also in the way they visualized those stories. You can find that boldness in the works of experimental directors like HONG Sangsoo or Yang Sung-woo, but you can also find it in more blockbusters, and that's really what set Korean cinema apart, I think, from other cinemas from the start of the 21st century. You can see it, for instance, in films, and I'm going to name two other films by Bong Joon-ho that you might have seen, because they both came out here in Belgium, The Host or Memories of Murder. They show boldness in the way they're filmed, in the way they tell a story that's quite unusual, for instance, for American blockbusters or European blockbusters. There are, if you look closely, different reasons, quite some different reasons why Korean cinema at the beginning of the 21st century suddenly was so prominent and why the quality was so high. But I think you can summarize all those reasons in one word: freedom. Freedom with a capital F. Because if you look back at the Korean, if you look back in time, you will see that the Korean cinema has been restrained almost for the whole 20th century. To explain that, we have to go back to the beginning of the 20th century. The first cinemas opened in Korea in 1903. But it took 15 years, more than 15 years, 16 years, until 1919, until the first Korean feature film was released. At that point, Korea had been annexed by Japan, and all Korean culture was under close scrutiny from the Japanese. The slightest piece of criticism on the Japanese was, of course, forbidden, and the films were restrained mostly to innocent subjects. But it could even get worse, because at the start of the Second World War, and the Second World War in Asia, in East Asia, started already in 1937 when Japan invaded China. In 1927, the Japanese opted for a complete assimilation of the Koreans. For instance, and it's only one example, all the Koreans had to adapt a Japanese name. So it's clear that the Korean cinema was born under a dark spell at the beginning of the first half of the 20th century. For instance, between 1919 and 1945, in more than a quarter of a century, there were only 160 films made in Korea. the Second World War freed Korea from the Japanese occupation, but as you all know, the problems went on. Korea's history stayed to say the least a bit bumpy, with first the Korean War and then the division of the country. In the Republic of Korea, commonly known as South Korea, but as you probably will know, South Korea is not an official name of the country, it's the Republic of Korea. Their film industry got set up in the 1960s, and it really boomed and bloomed during that decade. Still, there was a strong censorship. I'm going to try this one more time. There was a strong censorship. It was forbidden to show economical problems. It was forbidden to show political problems. It was forbidden to show poverty. It was forbidden to show social injustice. And of course, showing the slightest form of sympathy for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, commonly known as North Korea, or for communism was of course also forbidden, which led to safe, naive, goody-goody films. Exceptions do exist, but they are quite rare. One of the exceptions is director Kim Ki-yoon, the director who made the original version of The Housemaid in 1960. From 1973 onwards, the censorship got even worse, and we see that as a result that the Korean film production really plummeted from like 230 films at the end of the 1960s until 80 films a year during the 1980s. And it was only at the end of the 1980s that the censors loosened their grip on the Korean cinema, and the last censorship rule was abolished only in 1997. So Korea in the 20th century suffered three big traumas: Japanese occupation, the Korean War, and the division of the country. And it's not surprising, I think, that this society at the end of the 20th century is really very hungry for more freedom. And I think we can see in the cinema from the second half of the 1990s, in that cinema, that Korean cinema, I think we can see the manifestation of that freedom. One of the directors that really embraces that freedom is the director of whom you will see a film tonight, HONG Sangsoo. He made his first film, The Day the Pig Fell into the Well, in 1996, when he was 36, and since then he has made 15 feature films in total. In the beginning of his career, he released like one film every 2 years, but since and the film that you're going to see tonight has had its premiere in May 2010, since that year he has already made 5 more films, and I wouldn't be surprised if he was filming a 6th one for the moment, at the moment. I think that one of the reasons for his sudden speed up in his production tempo is just a question of money. Throughout the years, HONG Sangsoo has become a household name in the art house circuit. He's seen as a really innovator, especially when it comes to narrative structures. And we can say that he has found his audience. He's not attracting masses of people. For instance, this film that you're going to see tonight had more or less a bit more than 50,000 entrances in Korea. But producers are more keener to invest in these films nowadays than before, because they know that when you invest in a film like HONG Sangsoo, there will be at least a quite, not very big, but at least a certain audience that will come to his films. And another reason why they like to invest in his films is that he made films that are, as you will see, not very expensive. He has not only been called or be compared to Woody Allen, but he has also been called the Korean Michelangelo Antonioni, or the Korean Eric Romer. And I I'm not really sure that that those are good comparisons, but I let you be the judge of that, and I hope you will enjoy the film.